So, today we're going to be talking about nihilism.
The bane of modern society.
It's one of our favorite topics, and it is something that we talk about all the time.
Yes.
So why don't we start off here? Nihilism is essentially the default worldview of the modern world. Would you say that that's fair?
It's fair, and it comes from where? We've said that it's not just nihilism, right?
Well, let's dial it back a little bit, because Nietzsche prophesied that the next age was going to be an era of nihilism, because what was happening was that the traditional metaphysical framework within which people lived and within which they navigated the meaning of their own existence
Christianity.
began to deteriorate. Yeah, exactly. And in a sense, he was living through the consequence of that paradigm shift.
He was also kind of creating it through his works. You know, and Zarathustra was kind of this almost anti-Christian messiah.
Yeah, that's true. There is a prophetic element to the way Nietzsche presents himself, especially in that text. And I feel that he didn't create the nihilism. He created a heroic ethos that can respond to nihilism, that can reinvigorate the human project in the face of apparent nihilism.
Let's talk about this for a second. Let's talk about the day when he came out. He came up. What was the prevailing ideologies that gave birth to Nietzsche, that allowed Zarathustra to come about, and his own rigor and rancor?
Well, Nietzsche was fundamentally a disciple of Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer had made the will essential to the nature of reality. Obviously, that features largely in Nietzsche's whole conception of what reality is, what people are. But what really contributed, I mean, he was very influenced by Wagner. He was very influenced by a lot of things. But I think what's more interesting and compelling is what Nietzsche was reacting against. Traditional conceptions of morality, for example, of which Christianity was the prime example, right?
Definitely.
So Nietzsche said that we were moving into an age of nihilism because, in his words, we had brought about the death of God. And that means more than just the Judeo-Christian theistic God. It means the death of a transcendent world that makes this world intelligible. Part of the problem that gives rise to nihilism is whether or not suffering is perceived as being justifiable. And if there is another reality into which we can be delivered after death, then suffering is justifiable because there's something to look forward to. But if there isn't, then this life and the effort that it takes to persevere in this life appears to be arduous to the point of unacceptability.
Spiritual vacuum.
Yeah, you could call it that. It's a spiritual vacuum. But flash forward a little bit, because where I'd like to focus this is not on a historical analysis of Nietzsche so much per se, although we can touch on that. I'd like to talk about the universe and the place of humanity within it as conceived by people in general today. And two things I'd like to cite. One, Bertrand Russell. He has this saying. He says, only thus, on a firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be built. Or Steven Weinberg. He says, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. And
that's where we are today. The despair and the pointlessness.
Well, yeah, and I think you could argue that as human beings have appeared to be more peripheral and more contingent.
Peripheral?
Peripheral, like not central.
Oh, you mean towards the greater workings of the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Because in a Christian cosmology, humans are literally the center stage of the drama of existence.
Definitely.
And human beings underwent a series of progressive decenterings. We find out we're not physically the center of the universe. We find out that we are part of the animal kingdom, and so on. And there's more of a sense of perilous finitude and frightening contingency.
As kind of you draw back to the entire expanse of reality, as opposed to just, Earth and our place on Earth, our place in the universe, if we have such a thing.
Right.
What would that even be,
Right. So
You're dropping the bucket in this vast black seas of infinity. What did Lovecraft say?
Yeah, Lovecraft talks about the black seas of infinity.
We are not meant to travel far.
And when he describes the planets in outer space, he talks about them without number or name. He talks about these black spheres moving through these nameless abysses. And Lovecraft kind of captures what it means to be alienated from reality. So, yeah, that kind of thing. So I would maintain that people attempt to escape from nihilism or to answer the challenge of nihilism by investing themselves in something else. I think that's the underlying motive force for consumerism and for the various other vacuous modalities that occupy people's attention and capture their life energy.
Yeah. Definitely. This could also be, you could go back to the idea of what suffering is. And I feel like this is kind of an expression of just kind of the almost primeval suffering from a kind of a Buddhist context.
Yeah, in a Buddhist context, suffering is inescapable. Suffering is part of the default condition of reality. And Buddhism responds to it in a constructive way because it provides a set of methodological frameworks that can be employed in order to overcome suffering. But suffering is perpetual, it's omnipresent, and like we were saying, it's the challenge of justifying suffering and or contextualizing our relationship to suffering that makes nihilism an essential challenge.
And we should also speak of, we're kind of talking about nihilism as a bad thing, right? But a lot of people champion it.
Yeah.
Especially in these days, from a lot of people coming out of Christianity. Speaking of our generation, definitely, we come out and then, okay, what's next? What do I gravitate to? What do I believe in, right? And a lot of people fall into hedonism. Consumerism will be kind of a part of that. And it's okay, I have this, I have all this life energy. How should I best expend it? Should it be? And a lot of people fall into this meaningless once they realize that they kind of have this God power that they can kind of create their own meaning. Now the meaning is not restricted by
that's
some
like
sort
bad
of theistic
faith,
God.
Right? Because I think that there is a connection between the specter of nihilism that people instinctively want to flee from and bad faith, the way Sartre talks about it, in as much as people make themselves believe that they don't have options. They make themselves believe that they don't have the degrees of freedom that they actually possess. And instead they say, well, I don't really have a choice to leave this job to find another partner, to pursue some activity that would be meaningful in the actualization of my potentials.
But also, our culture is kind of underwhelmingly absent of this real things that a human being could invest into, spiritually at least. I'm not going to talk about, various creative endeavors that one could apply themselves to and could find some sort of deeper spiritual meaning through. But when we look at the culture broadly, I mean, what is there for? This is getting back to my point. What is there for someone who falls out of Christianity, any sort of the Abrahamic faith? Say, okay, I don't want to be a Jew. I don't want to be a Muslim. I don't want to be a Christian. What do I have? Atheism has become much more popular, and that draws people. I already said hedonism, and then we have kind of this new agey morass.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that the New Age is a bad thing. I wouldn't say that atheism is a bad thing. I mean, the New Age, I have a kind of counterintuitive defense of it because it's sort of like the world's first peer-to-peer, fully modular, non-institutional religious movement. The New Age represents the same momentum which was problematic for Christianity and for any institutional religion that wants to maintain control over a narrative that everyone buys into. Because the reason why that you have to persecute heresy as zealously as many religions did is because
still do.
Yes, is because of the irrepressible, perpetually transforming nature of human creativity, right? As long as people are invested in the idea of Christ or any other religious figure, they are going to come up with different conceptions of what the career of Christ means, what the nature of Christ is, and they're going to perpetually spin out new heresies.
These endless pontifications over time by various leaders and thinkers, writers.
Yeah, you were telling me earlier about
the Arian heresy.
Yeah, what was that one?
Basically, the Arian heresy was before the Council of Nicaea. I think there was the Nicene theology versus Arianism, and at the time, I guess these weren't strictly delineated belief systems, but we're looking back on history. That's how we call them.
Right.
But Arianism is basically the idea that Jesus was subservient to God, and maybe he was along the line of angels or something like that.
So he wasn't fully divine. He was like on the level of an archangel or somewhere in the celestial hierarchy beneath God.
He was part of creation. He was not the creator. He was part of the creation. He was first and foremost amongst God's creation, but still subservient to the Father.
Heresy is fascinating. Like one heresy that people used to get burned to death for was the idea that you could enter the kingdom of heaven in virtue of your own ethical actions. That was considered to be a particularly grievous and dangerous heresy at one point. But now it forms basically a form of common sense for most practicing Christians. And, heresy itself is fascinating. And I always like to say that if you want to understand the momentum of the transformations of religious history, just look at the DC and Marvel universe. No, really. Because people become really upset when somebody violates the character of Batman or Luke Skywalker. And people have these really vitriolic reactions. They say that's not true to the character because that character has formed part of the furniture of their psyche. It's something in terms of which they have made sense of their lives. It is a map that they have used to navigate existence. And when someone starts to alter that, then they feel deeply threatened by it. Because the very coordinates of reality are being undermined.
That speaks to the kind of the strength of myth and how that's kind of a perennial thing in the human psyche, always.
Right. But I like to think that, the things like the crises in the DC universe and other universe-spanning multiversal reboots that happen in the Marvel universe or any of these fictional things, when they rebooted Star Trek, it's like you get this overproliferation of narrative and interpretation, and then when they do something like Crisis on Infinite Earths or whatever, it's kind of like the First Vatican Council or the Nicene Creed, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there is a need to constrain the ever-expanding proliferation of imagination and interpretation.
I think this is becoming even a much more mainstream and transparent idea. I saw a meme recently that compared the the kind of the Christian nationalist version of Jesus, which is basically just whatever the right wing morality is, and what they called canon Jesus, which would be from the New Testament, how Jesus is portrayed in the New Testament,
Right.
and saying how different they are, but using that strictly kind of like language of fiction, comic books, talking about canon, canonical versions of
Right.
characters. Oh, not. I said characters, talking about the Bible.
Well, I mean, characters, historical figures,
Yeah.
it bleeds together.
That's true.
With a lot of it, it's not just the Bible. Take Troy. You know, is that a historical event or is that a myth? You know what I'm saying? When we're talking about the death of Christianity, and you know, it hasn't died. And I think that religions never die. That's one of the things I like about Dune. Because when you read the appendix, you got like 10,000 years into the future, and you've got Zen Sunni shit, and you got Nava Christianity. And Frank Herbert's imagination just projected that, you know, none of these belief systems will actually evaporate. They'll just continue to mutate and interbreed and form new things. And I think that captures something really essential, because there are a lot of different ways that people talk about information, or rather how to define information. And I'm not sure I'm right about this, but I believe, if I recall correctly, that Dennett came up with a definition of information in which it is design worth stealing or worth copying. So there is something that is worth integrating into a subsequent iteration of the cascading series of self-replication.
Replication is a very important idea in reality.
Right, and speaking of Dennett, right, like there's that idea that nobody really designs religious systems. Because he had that interesting talk where he said, you know, people usually try to explain religion in terms of social cohesion or in terms of some kind of pragmatic cultural utility that it has. And he says that's really kind of dispensable, because you could just think about it along the same terms as Darwinianism. Because if you have a meme that's good at replicating, then that can cluster together with other memes that are effective at replicating, and then you find something that's even more viciously capable of replicating. So if you have a meme, for example, that says, well, you know, if you deviate from this belief, you will suffer eternal torment. And if you start coupling that together with other memes, like if your children deviate from this, then you should disown them. Then when they cluster together, you have a supervirus replicator.
Supervirus. Yeah, this was, we were talking about how Christianity has survived and become so prevalent. And it was that idea, plus the idea, I guess this, around the time that Christianity arose, and I guess historically, religion has been the provenance of the elite and of this very small group of people. But what Christianity offered was salvation, inclusion in this social cultural myth, with open to everyone in society, not just the elite or the priest class. And if you have that, combined with the idea that you just said of, you know, if you don't do this, you will be disowned, there's your supervirus.
Yeah, also Harari talks about the global popularity of Abrahamic monotheism and its associated mythologies, in terms of the fact that you now have a narrative in which the supreme metaphysical principle that governs the universe, and in terms of which everything is intelligent, is not only personal, but directly concerned with you and the welfare of your soul and the outcome of your actions. That's a good sales pitch.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that it doesn't have actual soteriological value. Just because we're trying to give a naturalistic reading of how these things come about in order to understand them from a sort of systems point of view is not to say that we devalue that they have some kind of spiritual utility. You know, and you know, I have significant differences with Christianity, so do you. But you know, I'm just saying, we're not like saying, you know, this is all. But nihilism. And I think I'm glad that we got off on this tangent about the nature of religion and the nature of Christianity, because it's the absence of Christianity that leaves a vacuum of meaning.
Vacuum again, yeah.
Right. So,
and these are deep things that we both had, because we both had our respective apostasies.
Yes.
And how we recovered our own meaning and place in society, reality, after these said things.
Right.
And then, you cannot really see these problems, or you cannot see the ideologies as such while you're a part of them. But once you step out of them and you experience this ostracization, then it's like, oh, okay, here it is. It's all open to me now. I can see.
You know that paraphrase that Ken Wilber does of Althusser that I've cited a couple times? Ideology, wherever ideology appears to be the most absent, that is where it is the most present.
Yeah.
And I think that captures something essential about the nature of ideology, because it is those beliefs about the world that we take to be unquestionable. And
laws of reality, laws of nature, almost.
Speaking of these experiences in apostasy, of breaking away from Christianity, but not only breaking away from Christianity, but breaking out of other cultural matrices.
Capitalism.
Yeah,
consumerism.
Sure, yeah, all kinds of things like that. Consensus reality in general. Because if we were to list a catalog of the sorts of things that we focus on and do and believe, all of those things are significantly outside the reality tunnel of consensus reality. So that's a series of apostasies. And what that brings to mind for me is Nietzsche's distinction between active nihilism and passive nihilism. Nietzsche says that the passive nihilist is one who gets disillusioned with the construct of meaning that they were invested in, and then they slander all possible meaning, right? So then, like this passage in Zarathustra, we were talking about before, we bookmarked some things to kind of pull out, right? And it says, "Alas, I knew noble men who lost their highest hope. Then they slandered all high hopes. Then they lived impudently in brief pleasures and barely cast their goals beyond the day. Spirit too is lust, so they said. Then the wings of their spirit broke, and now their spirit crawls about and soils what it gnaws. Once they thought of becoming heroes, now they are voluptuaries. The hero is for them an offense and a fright." And I think that's connected to the conception of the last man. And I think the last man is connected to the condition of the contemporary Western consumer. The last man is a condition into which there are enormous, carefully calculated forces that are trying to drive you. Because the more of a sense of lack you have, and the less of a sense of creative potentiality or of relentless inquiry, the more amenable you are to manipulation by advertisements, by political demagogues.
Definitely. Let's talk about those. You can see, you said this before, you can really understand a society by looking at the drugs that they do.
That's a Terence McKenna thing.
Okay, Terence McKenna said that, right? And so,
what drugs are acceptable? So
caffeine, right? Gotta keep going.
Alcohol, so that you can forget about how miserable everything is.
Numb your miserable life.
Oh yeah, it's all a self-reinforcing feedback loop that makes a given reality tunnel possible. And let's tie that back to the Dennett thing about religion, because a lot of people who are really hard into the conspiracy thing look at all the stuff that sucks about the world, and they say, well, this is clearly designed. And a lot of it is. And it's calculated, and it is vicious, and it is worse than someone who isn't studied in the history of this sort of stuff would
Psychological manipulation upon manipulation.
But at the same time, think about this Darwinian angle we were just talking about with respect to religion. You could make the same argument with respect to a lot of arguments about the hegemonic global system of control. think about what Dennett says when he brings up early criticism of Darwin. And one of these critics of Darwin kind of slanders Darwin by saying, well, the purport of Darwin's theory appears to be that in order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it is not necessary to know how to build one. And Dennett is like, yeah, that's exactly right. You can have a design without a designer. And I think that understanding the total system, which inflicts all this sort of dangerous, dispiriting, anti-human mind control on us through all kinds of subtle frameworks ranging from entertainment media to news
and
media
they are
to social
omnipresent.
media.
They are omnipresent.
Yeah.
Which is necessary to keep the illusion going.
What it is, it's the weaponization of samsara. It's weapons grade samsara. Because let's unpack that statement a little bit.
Yes.
So you've got dukkha, right? Which is one of the fundamental concepts in Buddhist philosophy. And dukkha is usually just translated as suffering. But etymologically, really, it means bad space. But it could also be translated with equal justification as meaning inadequacy, insufficiency, incompleteness,
unsatisfactoriness,
and lack.
Lack.
Yes. And lack is precisely that state of being that the hedono-apathetic consumer nihilist matrix
God.
Okay?
What a
tries
nightmare.
to exploit. Right? I was reading in one of Rushkoff's books the other day that it cites the fact that the more socially satisfied, and by extension, I think you could say the more psychologically satisfied, but the more socially satisfied a person is, the harder they are to manipulate. So what advertising does, and what all kinds of other tendrils of the control matrix do, is to try to deepen and expand that sense of lack. Because then you need what they have to offer you, to create wants and needs, so you can keep.
So they can keep selling you profits, selling you what you think you need. And a lot of these people haven't had the privilege of being able to even do these self-inquiries. A lot of people are just brought up in very dogmatic households and thrown into whatever social situations they are, and definitely have not even met someone to ask them about their own what they believe. So the self-inquiry hasn't even been done. So you just have these kind of desperate souls that don't even know that they're desperate, just kind of being thrown back and forth like rag dolls by like advertisers.
Yeah, I think it has to do with an artificially delimited horizon of possibility. Because the modern world doesn't appear in its fragility, its contingency, or its recency. We look at the world into which we are born, and it seems to have a sense of permanence and necessity.
Permanence that's a very important
But the thing
idea.
is that to the extent that you exist in society as conventionally defined, the degrees of freedom that you have for self-actualization, for creative freedom, and for positively benefiting the situation of others is restricted by the paint within the lines sort of paradigm, right? So we talked about passive nihilism, but I want to distinguish that from active nihilism, because that has to do with self-overcoming, and that also has to do with Socratic inquiry, which is kind of an odd thing because Nietzsche didn't like Socrates, but there's a sense in which they're similar. Because Nietzsche's conception of self-overcoming, of active nihilism, had to do with viciously attacking your own beliefs the hardest, going after the pillars of your own understanding of the world more aggressively than you would go after the pillars of some kind of philosophical antagonist conception of the world. And there's something deeply Socratic about that, because Socrates goes around.
It's a very brave thing.
What is truth? What is virtue? What does it mean to be a human being? All of that. So there is a synergy between the mode of being that Nietzsche advises as constituting a worthwhile and valuable human life and the Socratic enterprise. And And I think Socrates is really fucking important. And I think the reason and the way that they executed Socrates is, in a sense, constitutes the archetypal template of all possible revolutions. Because why did they kill Socrates? They killed him for corrupting the use and for introducing new gods.
Idea.
Right. So new gods means new ideas. I mean, of course, specifically it referred to like daemonion and all sorts of stuff. But new gods, I think, also means new principles, new perspectives, new vistas of possibility.
Something outside the whatever state dogma.
Right. And the thing is that what holds a society together is the collective field of belief and presupposition. And when you start to call that into question, you become dangerous.
Yeah, you threaten the power structure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about the heroes of, before I was talking about, so we're just looking at society in general, right? You look at the drugs that people do.
Yeah.
Let's look at, you start, the Zarathustra quote was about heroes.
Yeah.
Who are the heroes that we have? What do children have? This is what I was saying. I was talking about this impoverished person, the impoverished self that we have, and the lack of choices.
Right.
What heroes do people really have these days among the mainstream?
Well, I mean, it depends on
Things
what you're
to
plugged
strive
into.
for.
It depends on what you're plugged into. But I mean,
We're speaking very generally, though.
Yeah, it is kind of it's a general question, but I think it's getting at an important point, which has to do with that delimited horizon, artificially delimited horizon of possibility. And I think I would also connect that to what Chomsky talks about when he says that debate is allowed to be free in as much as it happens between certain poles. But to speak to your point from a little bit of a different angle, I think that a lot of the people who genuinely deserve heroic veneration don't even exist within the cultural ontology of the default reality tunnel.
And maybe those would be our heroes, since we don't exist in.
But there's no such thing
outside.
as a view from nowhere, and our heroes are the people who we find to be venerable for, a set of reasons that we find to be philosophically
Because they
justifiable.
have left.
Yeah, because
They have left the mainstream and have found something worthwhile to build themselves up with.
Yeah, I mean, who are my heroes
Yeah.
in this century? Terence McKenna, Aleister Crowley, and I say some of these with a little bit of reservation because I don't necessarily completely agree with at least the later person, but I find him to be a heroic personage in as much as he was... Well, for one thing, he was regarding religious constructs as systems that could be employed without necessarily subscribing to the worldview of that system as a kind of methodological structure. And that's pretty cool about Aleister Crowley, aside from all the artistic
Sensational
visionary
thing.
stuff.
Oh.
And then he did a lot of screwed up things. But obviously, those aren't people would tell you to make your hero. Those are people.
You don't hear about them in school. They're not venerated like Lincoln, and who else do people? Who's venerated in our culture, really? The founding fathers. Who else? Sports players.
Well, that could be hitting on a critical point because there is no universal veneration.
Well, I mean, no, American culture is somewhat homogenous.
Somewhat, but Republicans will venerate Ronald Reagan as like the ultimate guy, and Christians might venerate whoever. You know what I'm saying?
But everyone, and this is my point. Everyone venerates the founding fathers, both Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, but is that lip service, or do they generally have this kind of iconographic stature in which they are? I think probably in terms of cultural currency, the Avengers probably have more like emotional momentum behind them in the popular imagination than the founding fathers.
Yeah, but the founding fathers, not that I don't like them. I think they're scumbag, colonizer bastards. But I mean, they're literally imprinted in this culture, like the money, Mount Rushmore, holidays. So these are the things that form our actual culture.
Sure.
And this is the homogeny that you subscribe to when you become an American citizen. when you grow up in this culture.
Right. So you're saying the absence of figures of veneration is itself a sign of the absence of authentic values?
Yes.
Okay.
Nothing to, or think maybe figures that don't truly inspire anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that happens. Culture kind of molts off skins. And, in one century, someone will be amazing, and then it's just something that you're told to respect.
Mm-hmm.
But let's bring it back to nihilism. Existence seems pointless, right? And I think that's the problem. And I think that's the reason why we see such widespread forms of apathy. The reason why the default modality is apathy, conformity, and trying to kind of chase that down with some hedonism.
I think the fear is a big part of it too, especially as I've said before. We said you fall out of the dominant paradigm, and you realize that you kind of have this power to create yourself, and it's like, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be very scary for a lot of people to kind of maybe have to recreate your own morality.
Yeah, well, that is frightening, and that gets back to the bad faith
and then you
thing.
go back into, as you said, the apathy, the hedonism, and the consumerism.
Right. And moreover, what examples do you have of people who've escaped the matrix? People who've escaped the matrix become blasphemous figures that are
Terrorists.
scandalous. You know what I'm saying? People who genuinely exist outside of the default framework, they become, they're
Vilified.
Right. So nihilism, the absence of meaning not appearing to have existence. This is something I think deserves attention, because the dilemma of whether existence has a meaning in and of itself can be a little bit tricky. Because in order to say existence has a meaning, what do we mean when we say something has a meaning? Whether or not we're talking about its purpose, or whether or not we're talking about its value, to say that something has a meaning is to compare it to something outside of itself. Since there is nothing outside of existence, there is nothing in terms of which it can be compared, right? So the very concept of the meaning of existence sort of dissolves.
It also talks, I think, implicit in that is the idea that there has to be a telos.
Right. Well, these are all artifacts of this sort of Judeo-Christian cosmology.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's a telos, there's a designer, and here's another thing people say when they bemoan existence. They say, well, we're just an accident. The very
Cosmic
framework
accident.
of accident presupposes that there is an agent who can make a mistake, and that there was something better, which could have been the case, which wasn't, because of a failure to do things as they ought to have been. So to say, there's no meaning of existence, well, that kind of breaks down under analysis. And to call it an accident is also kind of beside the point. And I don't think that these are trivial observations, okay? Because a lot of the coordinates with which we make sense of experience on a local level within a kind of Newtonian limit case of reality.
What do you mean by local?
Well, I was going to make the argument that the common sense view of reality is roughly isomorphic with the Newtonian conception of reality, at least speaking in terms of tables and chairs and the laws, because
gravity.
Because we evolved to exist at a certain amount of mass and traveling at a given fraction of the speed of light. So what is intuitive to us because of evolution happens to be very closely correlated with Newtonian mechanics, right? So what appears to be the case, definitely, is itself contingent, right? So that sounds like a total aside, but it's a step to the point that I'm going to make, which is that even concepts that seem to be intuitive, necessary aspects of how things are on a very basic level are actually not. Like, take the concept of now, There's no such thing as a universal now. If you ask what time is it now on Alpha Centauri, well, it means, well, the other observer you're talking about, are they moving away from you right now or toward you? How fast? And that could make the difference of decades, right? So the concept of nowness is itself an artifact of a given vantage point inside of space-time. So if even nowness cannot be an aspect of reality as such, but only an aspect of reality as we experience it, given...
Oh, that's what you mean by locality.
Right. So I'm citing nowness as an example of something that seems necessary and absolute.
Okay.
When it's not. And all kinds of coordinates of reality are like that. And that's one of the things that makes philosophy fun for me, because philosophy is possibly the only discipline in which there are no fixed axes. Because what constitutes a valid inference, what constitutes a valid question, these are all things that are themselves controversial, and it can be reconfigured infinitely, because philosophy is precisely the residue of the hardest questions we don't even know how to think about.
The perennial question.
Well, to call them the perennial questions is to give them a kind of special mystical status in virtue of which they can never be solved. But they are questions.
Well,
the conceptual apparatus.
That's not so. Is that so wrong?
It depends on which question, because the failure to answer some of them, like let's say questions in the philosophy of mind, might have to do with the inadequacy of our concepts or the inadequacy of our experimental methods. So that may not be a universal question in the sense that it is perpetually ineffable and beyond the reach of our comprehension, unless it is. You know what I mean?
But do a lot of these questions have, I guess, hard, fast answers? Like, okay, I guess what we've come to expect from science as like a concrete answer. Like, this is the antidote to this virus, and this virus will die. I mean, do answers to questions like, is there a God, definitively exist? Like, ever? I mean, even all of these millennia of inquiry, philosophical inquiry we've had throughout civilizations. I mean, are there definitive answers? That's what I meant by calling it perennial.
The God question is a hard one.
Yeah.
Because you can explain the emergence of life out of prebiotic organic chemistry and stuff, and you can explain the emergence of the universe out of possibly a singularity, possibly not, but we know there's blah blah.
Things outside of space-time and within.
The thing about the scientific description of reality is that it's sort of causally closed. It works without having to invoke anything beyond the latest of causes and conditions. But the thing about that is that it is limited in the sense that science is fundamentally quantitative and objective, whereas consciousness is qualitative and subjective, right? So to that extent, there's a kind of awkward miss between our intuitive experience of consciousness and the scientific description of reality. I think
and they can never be matched. There will always be that gap, that gulf.
Well, Alan Wallace makes the argument that it is possible to address these things empirically. The problem is that most of Western science doesn't recognize contemplative modalities like shamatha and vipassana as legitimate
from
ways,
Theravada Buddhism.
Yeah, for Buddhism in general, as legitimate empirical inquiry into the properties of consciousness, because the conception of Wilbur makes this distinction between narrow empiricism and broad empiricism, where narrow empiricism is empiricism practiced under the aegis of the ideology of reductive materialism, where broad empiricism is experience writ large. And, if that sounds wildly untenable in a New Age sort of way, consider the fact that there have been empiricists who, Berkeley was an idealist, Hume was essentially a skeptical phenomenalist. So it's possible to be an empiricist while having a different, deriving a different ontology from empiricism as a methodology, right? But anyway, Wilbur says that meditation effectively satisfies the criteria of science, because what makes something scientific is if there is an injunction, do this, okay, heat this liquid, an apprehension, the liquid turns green, and then falsification by a community of the adequate. So, focus on your breath, learn to discern the three characteristics in your experience, that kind of thing. Okay, I've seen that all phenomena are empty of intrinsic existence, and falsification by a community of the adequate, and where you've got interlocutors who have a competence in what you're talking about. And so Wilbur makes the case, and Wallace makes the case, that meditation can be brought more effectively into dialogue with the rest of scientific discourse.
Okay.
And there is lots of science about meditation. The problem is it's kind of a one-way dialogue. Science kind of is interested in what it can get from contemplative traditions, but not in the ways in which it can be critiqued by said traditions. But to bring all this back around to nihilism, I think part of the problem, part of the reason people perceive the specter of nihilism in a way where it appears to be something from which you can only flee and not something that you can transcend, has to do with the problem of ultimate analysis. Because I think the reason why it seems like every value devalues itself, it has to do with the nature of emptiness. When you delve deep enough into a thing, you're finally left with nothing to point at that is the object. The essence that you thought you perceived is nowhere among its bases of designation.
So nihilism is almost a part of this kind of Buddhist soteriology?
I would say that nihilism is a consequence of the failure to distinguish between existence and intrinsic existence. Bring it back to Tsongkhapa, who says the truth is to step to the precipice of nihilism and then take one step back. Because there is an awful lot that is negated. You negate the sense that things exist independently, objectively, from their own side, under their own power. And yet, at the same time, there is conventional existence.
And I think that's a real danger. We're talking about belief systems and, how people interact with reality. And if you do this, I don't want to use the word wrong, but if you do this in a way that's maybe unwise, if you're just doing it on your own and maybe you don't have enough wisdom.
Trying to do ultimate analysis into the nature of reality? Well, I mean, you'd be pretty fucking lucky if you did that and it worked without any guidance.
That's what I mean.
But at the same time, there's ways to engage with this and to think about it, which could lead to serious misapprehensions. Yes. Because that's the thing. There is a peril there. In one of the texts of the Tibetan doxographical tradition, they talk about how as you go through progressively deeper schools, going up to the Madhyamaka Prasanjika, the challenge is you want to cut deep enough in order to get at the disease, but you don't want to cut...
And the disease is what?
The misapprehension of intrinsic existence. But you don't want to cut so deep that you negate causality, karma, rebirth, the capacity for...
Morality.
We're going down a really, really esoteric track. And, I think that's fine because there are other episodes where we can flesh some of these things out. But Madhyamaka Prasanjika, I'm trying to explain this as we talk about it. But maybe we should zoom back out. But... the appearance of meaningless has to do with the fact that when we try to examine it, it doesn't seem to be there in the way that it seemed to exist. In a way, you could talk about it a little bit less esoterically, because if you're looking at an existent thing, like a cloud, and then you try to climb up a hill to see the cloud disappears, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's only... Does that intuitively... Do you think that kind of illuminates what's being said when we talk about... negating the misapprehension of intrinsic existence and all that?
Not so much.
Well, the basic idea that if you look into what something is, you're finally left with nothing to point out is the object. I think that in general, when we articulate our epistemic strategies to the highest possible degree, like let's say when we look into creating axioms for the foundations of math, we run into Gödel's incompleteness theorem, or we look into empirically probing the ultimate nature of physical reality, we run into the uncertainty principle. No matter what, when you try to look into the essence of what constitutes something, what you find is a web of relationality. Okay, so we try to find the essence of life, purpose, and we find that it disappears into this diaphanous web of relationships. And we reify that as a substantially existent nothing, when in reality, we're close to to understanding reality as it is, which is as an interdependent lattice of causes and conditions, conceptual implication.
But the human mind always wants a more definitive thing that it can grasp and call knowledge, I think.
Yeah, that's true. But nihilism. How do we overcome nihilism? Or how can one begin to overcome nihilism?
I want to talk about this before, though, as nihilism as a necessary step after you're falling out of whatever dogma that you were inculcated with.
Yeah, well, that's the pendulum swing. Because the person gets disenchanted with the worldview that they took as default, and then they assume the opposite. I once had someone say to me in a conversation that if you go into a philosophy program and you believe in God, you're going to come out as an atheist. If you go into it as an atheist, you're going to come out believing in God. Because all the things that you were so intellectually and emotionally and culturally and psychologically invested in are going to take such a beating that then we try to take refuge in the opposite. That's that passive nihilism thing. You know, we are the meaning that we were invested in is destroyed, and so we say there is no meaning. We slander all high hopes, right? And then you're left as the last man. So Nietzsche talked about nihilism as a transitional thing.
Yeah.
Because having overcome the traditional conceptions of meaning and the traditional conceptions about the nature of reality and humanity's place in it, you can then create a clearing in which it is possible to define yourself through your own choices and decisions and create your own values, right? So the question is, I suppose you could put it on a kind of timeline, like you're invested in some kind of cultural matrix, consensus reality tunnel, and then there could be a period of nihilism, after which, if you persevere, right, and you know that
don't get lost in that.
Then you can go on to creating yourself. That's like the thing in Zarathustra, where first you accept the constructs of society as a camel that wants to put a load on it and thereby become strong by bearing the load, and then you become a lion. The purpose of the lion is to slay a dragon named Thou Shalt. And then, having slayed the dragon, you become a child, a self-propelled wheel. I really like that image because in the mystical
self-propelled wheel.
Yeah, in Diane Fortune's mystical Kabbalah, she talks about how the adepts who have attained to the highest sephira on the tree of life are these self-propelled wheels, right? And so, in a sense, I think that kind of poetically and iconographically captures a sense of unlimited possibility that we associate with supreme forms of enlightenment, right? But if you persevere through and you don't become passive nihilist, then you can recognize the possibility that's been created to discover new forms of value and meaning, and to create new forms of value,
which should be hopeful.
Yeah, it should be hopeful.
Very hopeful.
Because look, if there was a purpose to you, that some agent in space said, this is your purpose, this is what you're supposed to do, this is what you're for, that's not in keeping with the ethics of modernity or liberal democracy or fucking anything. Then it's just, to use your phrase, it's just cosmic feudalism. This is your purpose. This is what you're for. This is what your planet is for. This is what your reality is for. Do you really want there to be something that your planet, and your reality and your consciousness are for? Or do you want to create yourself? Do you want to create your own values? Do you want to create new vistas of possibility?
It's also scary, when you have this much power, because most of us, we grow up as consumers in these dogmatic frameworks, and we don't have much personal power. And so being offered this, well, not really offered, because we took this opportunity once you fall out of the dominant paradigm. Once you do that, to completely remake yourself with this much power that we've never had before. I think it's personally, I'm speaking personally, I think it's scary to, you reevaluate yourself. How have I built myself up?
Yeah.
What am I doing? Can I do this wrong? And, how am I spending my life? Is this bearing fruit? This deep, inquiry of active nihilism and the what do you call it? The exploration of other modalities of belief and being.
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah.
But
which is why a lot of people fall back into hedonism, probably.
That's why one of the things, and to get back into Buddhism, that's why one of the things you take refuge in is the community of other practitioners. Because the thing is, you know how Wilbur talks about levels of consciousness, and he says that the average level of consciousness will tend to pull you up if you're below it, but if you go above the average level of consciousness, it's going to pull you down. So what you need is a community of people.
What you need is a community.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Which is something that is far from being there in society. These things are very small. The good ones, the real ones, the legitimate ones.
Yeah, it's true. And a lot of them are sort of dangerous wacko cults, too.
There we go.
But, I'll say this. I once heard Deepak Chopra give this great metaphor about the emerging spiritual consciousness that could potentially come about in our world. And he talks about how when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, it goes into the chrysalis, it melts, it basically dies. But as it's doing so, there are these things called the imaginal cells, which gradually group together, and in the midst of the dying organism, they form something new and transcendent. Okay? So that comes back to Terence McKenna's injunction. Find the others. So really, if you want to go on this heroic quest of defining yourself and creating your own values, then find the others, and they will help you on the way. We're wrapping up here. We're at the end of the hour that we planned for this discussion.
Great talking.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Ontological Shock.